Look, here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. In 1986, a company that got its start making looms for silk weavers shipped a tiny four-wheel drive truck to American shores. The price tag read $6,200, roughly two-thirds what you'd pay for a Jeep Wrangler. Within 12 months, this little box on wheels was outselling the Wrangler by a ratio of 2 to 1. Think about that for a second. Jeep had been building four-wheel drive vehicles since World War II. They literally invented the category. Suzuki had been building them since, well, they bought a bankrupt company in a fire sale and figured they'd give it a shot. This is legacy motoring, and I spent way too much time thinking about automotive underdogs that changed everything. If you're someone who appreciates the stories behind the machines that defied all expectations and humiliated industry giants, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. This is the Suzuki Jimny, and this is how the cheapest four-wheel drive vehicle ever manufactured managed to humiliate some of the biggest and most established names in the entire automotive world. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds like typical YouTube exaggeration. Another clickbait story about some obscure vehicle that had a brief moment in the sun before fading into irrelevance. But here's the thing, the Jimny didn't fade. It's been in continuous production for 55 years across 4 generations. 3 million units have rolled off assembly lines and into 194 countries. And right now, as I'm recording this, people are sitting on waiting lists that stretch 4 years into the future just to buy one. Used examples sell for more than their original retail price. Dealers add 5-figure markups and still can't keep them in stock. A vehicle designed from day one to be the absolute cheapest capable four-wheel drive you could buy has somehow become one of the most desirable vehicles on the planet. That's not normal. That's not supposed to happen. And to understand how it did happen, you need to understand where this whole thing started. Not from some grand automotive dynasty with decades of engineering heritage and racing pedigree, not from a government contract that established manufacturing capability, from looms. Actual weaving looms, the kind your great-grandmother might have used to make fabric. Mikio Suzuki was born in 1887, the son of cotton farmers in a small coastal village called Hamamatsu, about 120 miles from Tokyo. The village was known for textiles and woodworking, not exactly the cradle of automotive innovation. At 14 years old, Mikio apprenticed under a demanding carpenter named Kotaro Imamura. 7 years of strict, unforgiving training in traditional Japanese craftsmanship. When the Russo-Japanese War started in 1904, demand for carpenters collapsed practically overnight, and Imamura was forced to take work maintaining looms on a factory floor. He considered it beneath him, degrading work for a master craftsman. His apprentice disagreed completely. Michio flourished around the machines. He found something in the mechanical precision of those looms that captivated him in ways that woodworking never had. He finished his apprenticeship in 1908. By 1909, at just 22 years old, he had watched his mother struggle with her primitive hand loom, designed a pedal-driven version that wove cloth 10 times faster, and founded the Suzuki Loom Works. Word spread through the village. Orders came in from textile operations throughout the region. For the next 30 years, the company did nothing but build weaving machines, and they were exceptionally good at it. Their sarong loom, which used an innovative punch card system to weave patterned cloth, was exported across Southeast Asia and won national industry awards. The company went public in 1920. By the late 1930s, Michio held over 120 patents for loom technology. Then, he decided he wanted to build cars. Here's what most people don't realize about early automotive history. The line between textile companies and car manufacturers was surprisingly blurry. The precision engineering required for complex looms translated remarkably well to engine and transmission design. But Michio's timing was terrible. He completed several prototypes by 1939, decent ones actually, featuring liquid-cooled 4-stroke, 4-cylinder engines and surprisingly modern design for their era. Then, the Japanese government declared civilian passenger cars a non-essential commodity because there was a world war coming. The project died before it ever reached production. After the war, Suzuki went back to making looms. It was safe. It was familiar. They knew the business inside and out. Then, the cotton market collapsed in 1951, killing loom demand practically overnight. The company that had thrived for 4 decades suddenly had a product nobody wanted to buy. Suzuki pivoted again. Motorized bicycles first, the Power Free in 1952 with a tiny 36 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine. Then proper motorcycles as displacement and capability grew. Then in 1955, they finally produced their first car, the Suzulite. The company formally changed its name to Suzuki Motor Company in 1954. But this story isn't really about the Suzulite. It's about what happened when Suzuki's engineers decided they wanted to go off-road. In the late 1960s, the engineering team was studying a vehicle called the Steyr-Puch Haflinge, a small Austrian military off-roader that had earned a fierce reputation for capability, despite its diminutive size. The idea was to build something similar but smaller, something that fit Japan's K-car regulations. Now, you might be thinking that K-cars are just those tiny economy boxes that buzz around Japanese cities. And you'd be partially right, but the K-car classification had serious financial implications. These vehicles had strict limits on length, width, and engine size, but owners benefited from substantially lower taxes, cheaper insurance, and reduced registration fees. Building a proper off-roader that qualified as a K-car seemed almost contradictory. Every serious off-road vehicle in the world was big and heavy. That was just how it worked. Then, something better came along. In 1968, a tiny Japanese outfit called Hope Motor Company went bankrupt. Hope had designed a small off-road vehicle called the Hopestar ON 360. It was crude, no doors, a Mitsubishi-sourced 359 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine making 21 horsepower. The rear axle came from a Mitsubishi Colt. The wheels came from a Mitsubishi Jeep. It was essentially a box of Mitsubishi parts mounted on a basic ladder frame. Top speed was about 43 miles per hour, dropping to 30 in four-wheel drive. It was not what anyone would call the refined machine. Hope had managed to sell about 45 of them total. That's not a monthly figure. That's not a quarterly result. That's the entire production run. Ever. 45 vehicles. Mitsubishi was offered to design. They took one look at the sales figures and passed. Why would they want a failed product from a failed company? Suzuki's director, Osamu Suzuki, saw potential where nobody else did. He overcame fierce opposition within his own company and bought the whole operation. His colleagues thought he was wasting corporate money on a proven failure. They questioned his judgment openly. They thought the tiny off-road market in Japan couldn't possibly justify the development costs. He wasn't listening. He saw something they couldn't see. This is where it gets really interesting. The engineering challenge Suzuki's team now faced was deceptively simple on paper and enormously difficult in practice. Build a real four-wheel drive vehicle with a proper transfer case, low-range gearing, solid axles, and a ladder frame chassis. But make it small enough and light enough to qualify as a K-car. That meant staying under 3 meters in total length, under 1.3 meters wide, engine displacement under 360 cubic centimeters. These are serious constraints. The original Jeep Willys was over 3 meters long. Land Rovers were wider. Every proper off-road vehicle exceeded these limits by significant margins. Every single competitor building serious off-road vehicles was heading in the exact opposite direction. Land Rover was getting bigger with each successive model. Toyota's Land Cruiser was growing heavier and more powerful with every generation. Jeep had been scaling up since the original wartime Willys. The entire global off-road industry operated on one fundamental assumption that nobody questioned. Capability requires size, weight, and power. You need mass to push through obstacles. You need displacement to generate torque. You need length for stability. Suzuki looked at that consensus and rejected it completely. Their engineers argued the opposite case. A light vehicle doesn't need a big engine to climb a steep grade because it's not hauling as much mass against gravity. A narrow vehicle can thread through forest trails that would stop a wider truck cold. A short wheelbase can negotiate tight switchbacks without multiple backing maneuvers. Weight was the enemy of off-road performance, not the foundation of it. This was genuinely revolutionary thinking for the era, and it turned out to be absolutely correct. Suzuki took the Hopestar chassis, threw out the Mitsubishi engine, and installed their own air-cooled 359 cubic centimeter two-stroke twin-cylinder making 25 horsepower. They redesigned the body from scratch with their own specifications. They kept the ladder frame because it was fundamentally sound engineering. They added a proper part-time four-wheel drive system with a dedicated transfer case offering both high and low-range gearing selected by a physical lever in the cabin between the gearbox lever and the handbrake. They fitted leaf springs and solid beam axles front and rear, the same fundamental suspension architecture as the full-size Land Rover and Toyota Land Cruiser, vehicles that weighed 3 or 4 times as much. The Suzuki engineers understood that this architecture worked for off-road applications regardless of scale. And to keep the total length under 3 meters, they mounted the spare tire inside the vehicle behind the front seats. This made it a 3-seater, but it preserved the key car classification and all the financial benefits that came with it. Tax savings trumped a 4th seat. Practical compromises for practical advantages. In April 1970, the Suzuki LJ10 rolled off the production line. LJ stood for Light Jeep. Subtle naming choice there, Suzuki. The lawyers at Jeep probably took notice but decided the tiny Japanese truck wasn't worth the international legal battle. It weighed 590 kilograms, about 1,300 pounds. For context, that's less than a modern motorcycle with a sidecar attached. It had 16-inch wheels and a top speed of 47 miles per hour. It looked like someone had put a Land Rover in the dryer on high heat, shrunk it down to toy size, and somehow kept all the important mechanical bits intact. And it was the first 4-wheel drive kei car to enter series production anywhere in the world. Suzuki had created an entirely new vehicle category. The entire first year of production was done by hand because Suzuki hadn't expected real demand. They figured they'd sell a few hundred to forestry workers and farmers who needed something small enough to navigate tight mountain roads. They were catastrophically wrong about the demand. 5,000 units sold domestically in year 1. Outselling the Mitsubishi Jeep in Japan. The vehicle that Mitsubishi had declined to build was now beating Mitsubishi's own product on their home territory. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Suzuki scrambled to set up a proper assembly line, and they never stopped improving the design. 1972 brought the LJ20 with a water-cooled engine and, crucially, left-hand drive variants for export markets. That was a signal. Global ambitions were officially announced. A U.S. company called International Equipment Corporation imported a few thousand of these early Jimnys, selling about 3,500 units, mostly in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Not a sensation by any measure, but a proof of concept. Americans would buy a tiny Japanese off-roader if given the chance. By 1975, the LJ50 arrived with a larger 539 cubic centimeter 3-cylinder engine, initially targeting Australia. Then the LJ80 got an 800 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder. The second generation launched in 1981 with a redesigned chassis, improved on-road behavior, and a 970 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder. Body styles multiplied across the range: convertibles, hardtops, pickups, 5-door wagons, options for every market and application. Australia got it as a Sierra. Spain, Santana Motors assembled them locally with softened suspension and cloth interiors tailored for European buyers. In India, Maruti Suzuki produced it as the Gypsy for the military and police forces. The platform was everywhere. Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Europe. It was becoming one of the most widely distributed vehicle platforms on the planet, while most Americans had never heard of it. And then Suzuki decided to take on America properly this time, not through some small import operation selling a few thousand units to enthusiasts in the desert states, a real launch with real dealer networks and real marketing muscle behind it. In 1985, the second-generation Jimny arrived in U.S. showrooms, wearing a new name, the Suzuki Samurai. The naming choice was deliberate. Samurai evoked strength, precision, warrior spirit, everything Suzuki wanted American buyers to associate with their tiny truck. It packed a 1.3-liter four-cylinder making 63 horsepower. 0-60 happened in 16.9 seconds if you were patient and the road was flat and the wind was at your back. Quarter-mile times came in around 20.5 seconds. Those aren't performance numbers by any reasonable standard. Those are patience numbers, numbers that would make a modern economy car look like a sports car by comparison.
But here's the thing. Performance on pavement was never the point. Suzuki wasn't trying to compete with Mustangs or Camaros. They were building a tool for a specific purpose. The Samurai had manual locking front hubs that required you to get out of the vehicle and physically turn a dial on each wheel hub to engage four-wheel drive. It had a 2-speed transfer case with real low-range gearing for serious terrain, leaf springs front and rear, solid axles at both ends, a ladder frame chassis that could flex over obstacles without cracking, genuine off-road hardware wrapped in a package that looked almost toy-like compared to the competition. The base price was $6,200. A loaded version with all the options cost around $7,500. The Jeep Wrangler started north of $9,000 and climbed rapidly from there with options. Suzuki had undercut the most famous name in off-roading by a full third, and they were clever about the rollout in ways that showed they understood the American market better than many domestic companies did. First wave of dealerships went into California, Florida, and Georgia, high population states with year-round outdoor recreation cultures, places where people actually used off-road vehicles for recreation rather than just posing as shopping malls. Every Samurai shipped with a full accessories catalog: roof racks, bumper guards, upgraded wheels, light bars, brush bars, winch mounts, upgraded suspension components. The catalog was thick and comprehensive. Suzuki understood something about the American market that many foreign companies missed completely. Americans don't just buy off-road trucks, they personalize them, they modify them, they make them expressions of individual identity. Giving customers the ability to customize at the point of purchase was a masterstroke that turned every Samurai into a platform for self-expression. Suzuki planned for 1,200 imports per month. Conservative projections based on realistic market analysis, reasonable numbers for a new entrant in an established market segment. They sold 47,000 units in the first calendar year, nearly 4 times their monthly projection every single month. By mid-1988, they were moving 8,000 units per month, over 150,000 Samurais sold in just 3 years. The Samurai became the best-selling convertible in the United States, not the best-selling off-roader, the best-selling convertible, period, beating Mustang convertibles, beating Corvettes. A tiny Japanese truck with 63 horsepower was outselling American sports car icons in the convertible category. It also captured the best first-year sales record of any Japanese car company entering the American market, better than Toyota's initial launch, better than Honda's first push, better than Nissan. Suzuki had done something unprecedented. And in 1987, the Samurai outsold the Jeep Wrangler by nearly 2-to-1. A loom company from Hamamatsu was beating Jeep at Jeep's own game on Jeep's home territory. Now, you might be thinking there must have been some trick to this, some marketing gimmick or temporary pricing strategy that artificially inflated sales. But the answer is simpler and more interesting than that. The Samurai was genuinely good at what it was designed to do. And to understand why 63 horsepower managed to be competitive off-road against vehicles with 4 or 5 times the power, you need to understand some basic physics. Start with weight. The Samurai tipped the scales at about 2,300 pounds ready to roll. The contemporary Jeep Wrangler weighed closer to 3,000 pounds. That 700-pound gap might not sound like much, but it makes an enormous difference in off-road conditions. Lighter vehicles exert less ground pressure per square inch. They ride over soft surfaces that swallow heavier trucks.
They need less power to climb the same grade because they're fighting less gravitational resistance. They're dramatically easier to extract when stuck because there's simply less mass to move. Here's what most people don't realize about off-road performance. 63 horsepower pulling 2,300 pounds has a better effective power-to-weight ratio per unit of resistance than 112 horsepower hauling 3,000 pounds through deeper ruts. The lighter vehicle isn't fighting through the terrain, it's floating across it. The ladder frame chassis underpinned everything and made the whole system work. Unlike unibody construction, where the body panels themselves are load-bearing structural elements, the Jimny's body sits on a separate steel ladder frame. The frame can flex and twist over uneven ground without cracking body panels, popping windows, or causing structural failure. Hit a rock with the body and you've dented some sheet metal. Annoying, but cosmetic. The frame underneath is completely fine. The structural integrity remains completely intact. This is why you see old Jimnys with battered, dented, beaten-up bodies still running perfectly after decades of abuse. The damage is cosmetic. The skeleton underneath is designed to take punishment and keep working. Solid beam axles at both ends gave the Samurai genuine wheel articulation. This is the single biggest advantage over independent suspension in off-road conditions, and it's something most modern SUV buyers don't understand at all. When one wheel climbs over an obstacle with a solid axle setup, the opposite wheel on the same axle is mechanically pushed down toward the ground. The axle acts like a seesaw. One side goes up, the other side goes down. This maintains tire contact with the terrain, even on extremely uneven surfaces. Independent suspension, which almost every modern crossover and most contemporary SUVs use, lets each wheel move separately with no mechanical connection between them. Great for highway comfort because each wheel can absorb bumps independently without affecting the others. Terrible for keeping traction on broken ground. When an independently suspended wheel drops into a hole, the opposite wheel doesn't compensate at all. It just stays where it is while you lose contact area. Your tire is spinning uselessly in the air while the one across from it sits there doing nothing. The Samurai kept 4 patches of rubber on the ground in conditions where more sophisticated vehicles had wheels spinning uselessly with no traction at all. The 2-speed transfer case was the real torque multiplier that made everything work. High range for normal rear-wheel drive operation on pavement and mild trails. 4 high for all-wheel traction on slippery surfaces like mud, snow, or loose gravel. 4 low for serious technical terrain where you needed maximum mechanical advantage. In low range, the effective torque delivered to the wheels roughly doubled while maximum speed was cut in half. This is the part most people completely miss when they laugh at 63 horsepower. Run that modest output through low range and first gear simultaneously, and the force reaching the tires was more than enough for steep rock faces, deep mud, and river crossings. Horsepower is an overrated metric for off-road work. Magazine writers and casual enthusiasts obsess over horsepower numbers because they're easy to understand and compare, but torque multiplication through gearing is what actually moves a vehicle over obstacles. The Samurai's transfer case had a lower final drive ratio in 4 low than the Wrangler system, meaning it could operate at even slower, more controlled speeds on technical terrain before needing to shift gears. Slow and steady with maximum mechanical advantage beats fast and powerful when you're crawling over boulders. The Samurai's compact dimensions created approach geometry that worked consistently in its favor. Short wheelbase, narrow track width, almost no front or rear overhang beyond the wheels. This translated directly to steep approach angles, departure angles, and breakover angles. Technical terms that describe how steep an incline you can climb without the front bumper plowing into the hillside, how sharp a drop you can descend without the rear end catching on the crest, and how severe a ridge you can cross without getting hung up on your belly at the center. The Samurai could climb steeper inclines, descend sharper drops, and crest sharper ridges than vehicles that cost twice as much and made 3 times the power. Bigger, longer vehicles with their lower bumpers and extended wheelbases routinely got stuck on terrain the Samurai could skip across without drama. Experienced off-roaders figured this out quickly and spread the word through clubs and magazines. Size isn't always an advantage in the woods. Sometimes it's a liability. The vehicle that fits between the trees is the one that gets to the other side. The vehicle that clears the rocks is the one that makes it through. The vehicle light enough to float across the mud is the one that doesn't need a winch extraction. The engine itself was deliberately, intentionally, almost stubbornly simple. No turbocharger to fail at altitude or overheat during sustained low-speed climbs when airflow through the radiator dropped to nothing. No complex electronic fuel injection system to malfunction during water crossings or throw mysterious error codes in remote locations with no cell service and no dealership within 100 miles. No computers managing the four-wheel drive engagement. No electronic sensors deciding when you needed traction and when you didn't. Every critical system was purely mechanical. A physical lever engaged four-wheel drive. You pushed it, things happened. Manual locking hubs required the driver to get out and turn a dial on the wheel hub itself. Physical engagement, physical confirmation. If something broke in the backcountry, a basic toolkit and some mechanical intuition could get you home. Shade tree repairs were possible because there were no black boxes to interrogate. At extreme altitudes where electronic fuel injection systems stumbled in thin air and sensors threw fits about oxygen content and atmospheric pressure, the Samurai's simple carburetor could be rejetted in a parking lot by anyone with a screwdriver and the right jet kit. No laptop required, no dealer diagnostic connection, just mechanical understanding and basic tools. Which brings us to perhaps the single greatest humiliation the Jimny ever delivered to a major corporation. A story so perfectly ironic that it almost seems scripted for maximum embarrassment. In 2007, Chrysler was launching the new JK generation Jeep Wrangler. This was a major redesign with significant changes from the beloved TJ generation. Some enthusiasts were skeptical about the new four-door configuration, which seemed to contradict everything the Wrangler was supposed to represent. Others questioned the replacement of the bulletproof AMC-derived inline six-cylinder engine with a less proven V6. Jeep wanted a statement, a spectacle, something that would put the Wrangler back on top of the capability conversation and silence the critics who said the brand had gone soft. Something that would generate headlines and prove the new platform could handle anything. So Chrysler built two modified Wrangler Unlimited Rubicons specifically for a record attempt. They fitted them with aggressive Goodyear MTR tires, heavy-duty winches, and electronic altitude measurement equipment verified for accuracy. They hired German expedition leader Matthias Jeschke and his professional extreme events team, people who had done high-altitude vehicle expeditions around the world. The target was Ojos del Salado, the highest active volcano in the world, sitting on the Argentina-Chile border at 22,615 feet above sea level, higher than any peak in North America, higher than most aircraft fly, an environment so hostile that the air holds only half the oxygen found at sea level and temperatures routinely drop below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The climb took 5 days of grueling effort. Hurricane-strength winds battered the vehicles constantly. Temperatures plunged to -22 degrees Fahrenheit at night. The team executed punishing high-altitude glacier traversals across sheer ice fields that would swallow a vehicle forever if the driver made a single mistake. Oxygen was thin enough to make clear thinking difficult and physical exertion exhausting. The Jeeps reached 21,962 feet above sea level, a legitimate hardcore achievement by any reasonable measure, higher than any production four-wheel drive vehicle had ever been documented driving under its own power. Jeschke declared the Wranglers unbeatable. At Jeep's direction, his team erected a sign at the high point that read, "Jeep parking only. All others don't make it up here anyway." The corporate confidence was absolute. They had proven something meaningful about their product's capability. Chrysler's communications team issued a glowing press release calling it definitive proof that the new Wrangler stood apart from all other four-wheel drive vehicles on the planet. Marketing materials were prepared, the narrative was set. Jeep had reclaimed its rightful place at the top of the capability hierarchy. The record lasted about 3 weeks. Two local Chileans from the Atacama region, Gonzalo Bravo and Eduardo Canales, had been planning their own attempt at the Ojos del Salado altitude record for some time before Jeep's expedition. They weren't racing Jeep specifically, they just wanted to see how high they could get. Their vehicle was not a new factory-backed machine with corporate engineering support and a professional expedition team. It was a 1986 Suzuki Samurai. 21 years old, the same vintage that had been destroyed by Consumer Reports testing and pulled from the American market over a decade earlier. Bravo had modified it himself, in his own shop, with his own hands. Stronger axles sourced from larger vehicles and adapted to fit. Lower gear ratios for maximum torque multiplication at altitude. Air lockers for guaranteed traction, larger tires for ground clearance and flotation, a supercharged G16A four-cylinder engine specifically tuned for the thin air at extreme altitude. But it was still a Samurai underneath all the modifications, still the platform that was designed from day one to be the absolute cheapest capable four-wheel drive vehicle you could buy. The platform that Chrysler would never acknowledge as competition. First attempt came on January 1, 2007. Snowstorm rolled in and conditions became impossible. They had to turn back before reaching any significant altitude. The mountain wasn't cooperating. Second attempt came a month later. The engine caught fire at 20,731 feet when a hydraulic reservoir failed catastrophically and sprayed fluid directly onto the hot exhaust manifold. They were forced to tow the burning truck back down the volcano with fire extinguishers, barely keeping the flames contained. Most people would have called it quits at that point. They'd proven the concept wasn't viable. The universe was clearly telling them to stop. But Bravo and Canales weren't most people. They repaired the Samurai, fixed the hydraulic system, reinforced the vulnerable components, and went back up the volcano. On April 21, 2007, Bravo and Canales drove their 21-year-old Samurai past the Jeep team's documented high point and kept climbing. They didn't stop until they reached 21,942 feet above sea level, 138 feet higher than the factory-funded Chrysler Expedition with its professional team and corporate resources. On the way back down, they found the Jeep parking only sign lying flat on the ground, blown over by Andean winds. They picked it up and brought it home as a souvenir. Physical evidence of an embarrassment that Chrysler's marketing department would prefer never happened. Guinness World Records certified the altitude record in July 2007. Two guys from Chile in a 21-year-old budget truck, entirely self-funded, with no corporate backing and no professional support team, had beaten Jeep on the highest active volcano on Earth using a vehicle Jeep wouldn't acknowledge existed. That is a humiliation that no amount of marketing spent can erase, no press release can spin, no corporate messaging can overcome. The cheapest four-wheel drive ever made had climbed higher than Jeep's best effort, and there was physical evidence sitting in a Chilean garage to prove it forever. But the Samurai's American story has a dark chapter that explains why you can't buy a new Jimny in the United States today. A chapter that shows how quickly success can collapse and how powerful institutional forces can destroy a product regardless of its actual merits. In June of 1988, Consumer Reports magazine published a review with a headline designed to terrify every Samurai owner in America. Warning: the Suzuki Samurai rolls over too easily. During their proprietary short course avoidance maneuver testing, the Samurai had tipped up onto two wheels. The magazine gave it a not acceptable rating, the first vehicle to receive that damning designation in over a decade. Footage of the near rollover played on television news broadcasts across the country. Every network ran the story. Every local news program picked it up. The visual of a samurai teetering on two wheels became one of the most watched automotive clips of the decade. Sales fell off a cliff immediately. The estimates vary depending on the source, but the consensus is that annual sales dropped from roughly 72,000 units to approximately 2,000 units, a 97% collapse. Overnight, the samurai went from sales sensation to industry pariah. Dealers couldn't give them away. Resale values collapsed, owners faced harassment from strangers who'd seen the news coverage. But here's what most people don't realize about that Consumer Reports story. The full picture was much messier and more complicated than the headline suggested. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration later criticized the Consumer Reports testing methodology because of significant driver variation between test runs. NHTSA pointed out that they use robotic controllers in their own rollover resistance tests specifically to minimize human inconsistency. When a human driver is sawing at the wheel trying to execute a rapid avoidance maneuver, tiny variations in timing, steering angle, and throttle application can produce dramatically different results. The same driver running the same test 10 times might get 10 different outcomes. Suzuki fired back hard with their own investigation. They alleged the test had been manipulated to produce the desired result. They presented evidence that Consumer Reports employees had cheered when the vehicle finally tipped during testing, that the test course itself had been modified after a senior Consumer Reports executive, who was not a trained test driver, managed to tip the vehicle during an informal evaluation drive.
According to Suzuki's legal filings, the testing evolved from a repeatable scientific evaluation into a determined effort to force a rollover on camera. The magazine needed dramatic footage to support their predetermined conclusion, and they kept adjusting variables until they got it. The lawsuit Suzuki filed in 1996 worked its way through the court system for years. It eventually reached the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a 2-to-1 ruling found that a reasonable jury could conclude the tests were specifically designed to produce a predetermined outcome. The majority opinion suggested that Consumer Reports may have been more interested in generating a sensational story than conducting objective safety research. But by the time that ruling came down, the Samurai had been dead in the US market for over a year. Suzuki discontinued American sales in 1995. Over 200,000 units had been sold in America by then, but the brand damage was irreparable. The settlement finally came in 2004, with both sides issuing a carefully worded joint statement. Consumer Reports acknowledged they never intended to imply the Samurai easily rolled over in routine driving situations. Government studies confirmed its real-world rollover rates fell within the normal range for comparable utility vehicles of that era. The modern Jeep Wrangler currently has the second worst rollover probability rating among SUVs tested by federal safety agencies. Nobody ever ran that story with the same breathless energy. No television news program led with warnings about Wrangler rollover risks. The double standard was never addressed. While the Samurai was being destroyed by headlines in America, the Jimny quietly thrived across the rest of the world, where Consumer Reports had no influence and American media coverage meant nothing. The platform kept evolving, kept improving, kept selling in markets that judged it on actual capability rather than manufactured controversy. It had company in the cheap but capable category too. The Russian Lada Niva, which launched in 1977, took a remarkably similar philosophy and ran with it aggressively. The Niva's designers literally described their creation as a Renault 5 chassis put underneath a Land Rover body. Small, light, simple, cheap. It grabbed 40% of the European off-road market by 1978 and even finished second overall in the grueling Paris-Dakar Rally, beating factory-supported Mercedes and Range Rover entries with professional drivers and unlimited budgets. But the Niva never matched the Jimny's global reach or production longevity. Soviet-era quality control issues and limited spare parts availability outside Eastern Europe kept it from achieving true worldwide distribution. The Jimny outlasted them all. It outlasted the original Land Rover Defender. It outlasted the FJ40 Land Cruiser. It outlasted every competitor that tried to occupy the same market space.
The third generation arrived in 1998, with coil springs finally replacing the old leaf spring setup. Smoother ride quality on pavement, better wheel articulation off-road because coil springs allow more suspension travel than leaf springs of equivalent size. But underneath those modern springs sat the same fundamental architecture. Still the ladder frame, still the solid axles, still the transfer case with proper low-range gearing. Still simple, still cheap, still capable of going anywhere the expensive trucks went. Then came the fourth generation in 2018, and the automotive world collectively lost its mind. Suzuki had set a conservative sales target of 15,000 units for Japan's first year of fourth-generation production. Reasonable projections based on historical data and market analysis. Orders crossed that number in 30 days, not 30 months, 30 days. Waiting lists in the United Kingdom hit a full year almost immediately after orders opened. Dealers couldn't quote delivery dates with any confidence because the factory allocation system couldn't keep pace with demand. In parts of Southeast Asia, waiting lists stretched to multiple years. People were putting down deposits knowing they wouldn't see their vehicle until 2022 or 2023. Suzuki actually had to suspend Jimny passenger car sales in Europe entirely because the vehicle's CO2 emissions were dragging up their corporate fleet average under strict EU regulations. Every manufacturer selling cars in Europe must meet fleet-wide emissions targets, and exceeding them triggers substantial fines. The Jimny's relatively thirsty onion and old-school engineering meant it produced more CO2 than modern crossovers with hybrid systems and turbo-downsized engines. Their solution was pure Suzuki ingenuity. They removed the rear seats from the European market Jimny, reclassified it as a light commercial vehicle rather than a passenger car, and kept selling it under different regulatory framework. Commercial vehicles have different emissions accounting rules. Problem solved, technically speaking. When the 5-door Jimny Nomad launched in Japan in April 2025, over 50,000 reservations came in within 4 days. Suzuki had ramped monthly production from 1,200 units to 3,300 units in anticipation of strong demand. The waiting list still stretched to 4 years. 4 years for a vehicle that costs less than most premium crossovers. Used fourth-generation Jimnys routinely sell above their original retail price in markets around the world. In Australia, dealer markups of 10,000 Australian dollars became standard practice, and buyers paid them without complaint. When 500 units were allocated for a new sales batch in one Australian state, they sold out in 5 hours. A vehicle designed from its very first generation to be the cheapest capable four-wheel drive on the planet had somehow become so desirable that people paid substantial premiums just to skip the queue. The economics made no logical sense until you understood what the Jimny represented. 3 million Jimnys sold across 55 years. 194 countries have received official distribution. And somehow, impossibly, frustratingly, the vehicle is still unavailable in the United States. Federal crashworthiness standards have evolved significantly since the Samurai era. Mandatory advanced driver assistance systems, including automatic emergency braking and lane departure warnings, are now required for new vehicle sales. Pedestrian impact protection regulations require hood designs that cushion impacts in ways the Jimny's flat-fronted styling cannot easily accommodate. Euro NCAP gave the fourth-generation Jimny 3 stars out of 5 in their safety evaluation, citing specific demerits in pedestrian protection systems and electronic safety aids. For the European market, 3 stars is acceptable, if not impressive. For the US market, that rating isn't close to sufficient for federal certification. So the country where the Samurai once outsold the Jeep Wrangler by 2-to-1 cannot legally purchase the modern version of that same vehicle. American enthusiasts who want a new Jimny must import them through gray market channels, registered as off-road only machines or agricultural equipment that never touches public roads. They pay inflated prices, often double the overseas retail cost, for a truck that was literally designed from day one to be affordable. The irony is structural at this point, baked into regulations and bureaucratic systems that nobody has the political will to change. The cheapest capable four-wheel drive ever made has become a forbidden luxury item in the world's largest automotive market. The Jimny proved something that the established off-road industry didn't want to hear and still refuses to fully acknowledge. You don't need to get bigger to get more capable. You just need to get smarter about weight, simplicity, and geometry. Size and power and complexity are not requirements for off-road capability. They're often obstacles to it. Every generation of Land Rover grew heavier, more complex, more electronic, and dramatically more expensive until the modern Defender became a luxury product costing north of $50,000, with touchscreens bigger than some televisions, and enough computing power to run a small business. Most Defenders will never see anything more challenging than a gravel parking lot at a ski resort. The Toyota Land Cruiser evolved into a $70,000 plus premium SUV that most owners will never take off pavements because they're terrified of scratching the paint or damaging the leather interior. It became a status symbol that happens to have four-wheel drive rather than a working tool that earns its keep. Jeep filled the Wrangler with screens, cameras, adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assist, and enough electronic systems to require software updates delivered over cellular connections. A modern Wrangler has more computing power than the space shuttle did. Whether that makes it better off-road is debatable. The Jimny stayed small, stayed mechanical, stayed cheap relative to the competition, and kept going everywhere the expensive trucks went. Frequently further actually, because it weighed half as much and fit through gaps they couldn't physically enter. Where a Land Cruiser needed a 15-point turn to navigate a forest switchback, the Jimny just drove through. Where a Wrangler bottomed out on a rocky ridge, the Jimny floated across on its minimal overhangs. There's a lesson buried in this story that goes well beyond the automotive industry. A lesson about assumptions and conventional wisdom and the danger of following the herd. A loom manufacturer bought a bankrupt company's failed prototype, a vehicle that had sold 45 units total in its entire production history. They built something smaller, lighter, and cheaper than anything the established market thought was viable. Every expert in the industry would have told them they were making a mistake. Small off-roaders can't work. Customers want size and power. The market has spoken. Suzuki ignored all of that expert advice and spent the next 55 years embarrassing companies with 10 times the budget, 100 times the engineering staff, and decades more experience in the four-wheel drive segment. The cheapest four-wheel drive ever made didn't just survive against the giants. It made them look expensive, overcomplicated, and fundamentally out of touch with what off-road capability actually requires. It climbed higher than Jeep's best effort on the world's tallest volcano. It outsold the Wrangler during its American peak. It generated waiting lists that luxury car brands would envy. 55 years of continuous production. 4 generations of evolution without abandoning core principles. 3 million trucks delivered to customers. 194 countries reached. And people are still waiting 4 years just to buy one, while paying premiums that would have horrified the original engineers who designed it to be cheap. That's the complete story of the Suzuki Jimny. A truck so inexpensive it shouldn't have worked, and so capable it stole Jeep's altitude record on the highest volcano on Earth. A vehicle born from a loom company's desperate pivot and a bankrupt competitor's abandoned prototype. A machine that proved the entire automotive industry wrong about what off-road capability requires. If you've driven one, owned one, or spent years on a waiting list that outlasts some marriages, drop your story in the comments. Those waiting list experiences alone deserve their own video. If you made it this far through the complete history of automotive's greatest underdog story, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week, digging into the engineering decisions and corporate strategies and strange historical accidents that created the vehicles that actually matter. And the next time someone tells you that success requires massive resources and established expertise and doing things the way they've always been done, remember the Jimny. Remember Mikio Suzuki and his looms. Remember 45 failed sales and the fire sale acquisition and 55 years of proving everybody wrong. Sometimes the smallest, cheapest, simplest solution isn't just acceptable. Sometimes it's better than everything else on the market.